QSO Today, episode 250, Bill Brown, WB8ELK. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur, who are demonstrating the new IC 9700 VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz all-mode transceiver this weekend at the Dayton Hamvention. If you're in Dayton, be sure to check it out. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, Hans Summers G0UPL's QRP Radio Kit Company. Hans has an amazing catalog of radio kits and parts for every budget. QRP Labs and Hans are in Dayton this weekend when the podcast posts. Be sure to find Hans and visit him as well. I want to thank both ICOM and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth4Z1UG, your host. I want to take this moment to wish condolences to the family and friends of Joe Everhart, N2CX, who was my guest in episode 245 of the QSO Today podcast just 5 weeks ago. Joe passed away suddenly this week. Joe is a major contributor and mentor to the amateur radio community. He will be missed. May his memory be for a blessing. Exploration of the edge of space, first by astronaut Jordan Kittinger in Project Highman, began Bill Brown WB6ELK's fascination with and adaptation of amateur radio to high-altitude weather balloons and later to smaller Pico balloons that Bill tracks around the world using amateur radio beacons that he fabricates himself for his balloon launches. With over 600 launches to his credit, it's easy to say that WB8ELK is an expert in high-altitude ballooning and amateur radio. Bill may have the hook to lure youngsters into our hobby, and he is my QSO today. WB8ELK, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Bill?
Yes. Good to talk to you.
Bill, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, my great-uncle, W8UN, was his call sign. Back in the 1950s, I was over visiting him. I was just about 4 or 5 years old. And he tuned his radio. He had a big, massive wall of Hammerlands and Hallicrafters radios and Johnson Viking, large, big racks of radio, which, of course, is impressive to a 4-year-old. And he tuned his radio, and there was this beep, beep, beep sound. And he says, "Did you know what that is?" I had no idea. I said, "That's a spacecraft. That's Sputnik." So right away, at a very early age, I was inspired for both amateur radio and the space program. So that was my very earliest memories of what inspired me to go into ham radio and later the space program. So after that, I studied when I got older, and I got my amateur radio license in 2 days after we landed on the moon. And
so you were licensed then in what, 69 then?
Yes.
Okay.
2 days after the moon landing.
Mm-hmm. And do you remember when that was? That was July, I think, wasn't it? 69?
July 22nd is when I got my ham radio license in 1969.
Mm-hmm.
And so this year, in July, will be my 50th anniversary in amateur radio.
Amazing.
So I went on to get a Hallicrafters SX101A, I went to the Dayton Hamvention and carried this 60-pound radio back to my car. And then I went back and I got a Johnson Viking 2, which also weighed about 60 pounds. After that, I loved Morse code and did a lot of CW work, and I was very avid on the high frequency bands.
Or where was the hometown?
Findlay, Ohio, northwest Ohio. And my uncle, W8UN, was my mentor. He first got his amateur radio license in the early 1920s, and in fact, he started out with Spark Gap until he started wiping out every radio receiver in town. He finally had to go to regular radio transmissions, but he started out with a Spark Gap transmitter.
Was that a novice license you got then in 1969?
Yes, it was Whiskey November 8, Echo Lima Kilo. And then just a few months later, I went up to get my license. We had to drive to the FCC office, which was in Detroit, Michigan. It was about a 120-mile drive. And we had to take a Morse code test and the general and advanced theory tests. My father, who was a radio man in the Navy in World War II, took the test with me, but the radio examiner failed him. And my dad said, "Why? I have perfect copy. I can go 30 words a minute, and this is only a 13-word-a-minute test." And the examiner says, "You didn't, wherever you have where it should have been a J, you put a U." Well, my dad doesn't cross the top of the J. It was quite obvious they were J's, but since he didn't put the little cross bar on the top of the J, the examiner flunked him, even though it was perfectly copied. So he went back a few months later, and whenever there was a J, he put this really long line above each J. And he told the examiner, "Is that J enough for you?" And he finally got his license.
And what was your father's call sign?
WB8, Mike Sierra Juliet, WB8MSJ. He's 93 years old and still active and ham radio, and lives on the farm that I grew up on.
Oh, that's quite amazing.
Up in Ohio. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're active. You've upgraded. So you upgraded to general or advanced at that time when you went to the FCC?
To an advanced class license, yes.
And now you have the extra?
I do not. I never bothered to get my extra license. I need to do that.
Uh-huh.
So what I did was, at that point, I got very much interested in amateur radio satellites, and they did a test of the AO6 and AO7 transponders from a private airplane that flew over the Midwest. And so I participated in that and talked through the transponder and during that test, and that really got me into the amateur satellite AMSAT group. In addition, I got involved in amateur television, both slow scan television and fast scan television, and I was very active in both those modes, both on UHF and HF.
Right, slow scan was an HF mode, as I recall, in those days.
Right, and one of my mentors there was one of the pioneers of slow scan, Whiskey 9 November Tango Papa, W9NTP, and Don Miller, and he was a very big influence on me in those days, and he lived in the next state over, and we would carry on conversations both on amateur television, fast scan, as well as slow scan.
Well, that's pretty amazing. Now, when you got your license, were you already through school?
I was in high school at the time when I got my license.
So did ham radio then play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Oh, absolutely. Well, there was two influences. One was chemistry and one was electrical engineering. So I went on to get my chemistry degree from Ohio State, and then I went on to get a master's in chemistry and a master's in electrical engineering from University of California, Santa Barbara.
Really? And when were you in Santa Barbara?
I was in Santa Barbara from 1975 through 1980.
I just missed you.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I graduated from UC Santa Barbara as well. And I started in 1980.
I was still there because I was a teaching assistant in the electronics, the double E department in 1980, up until the summer of 1980. And I still lived in Isla Vista, which, of course, we called Oila Vista.
Yes, yes.
The view of the oil. And I'm a Santa Barbarian. You've probably heard that.
Uh-huh.
And we called UCSB UC Surfing Branch.
It was indeed. And it was amazing time to be a student.
Oh, absolutely.
And it was amazing. It was an amazing place to be a student as well.
Oh, yeah. I went in to see my advisor, professor, and to ask him a question, and he was dressed in a wetsuit, holding a surfboard, and he says, "Not now, Bill. Surf's up. Come back in about an hour."
Well, you may recall, and this is an aside for the listeners, that that apparently all the surfers had either had a number that they called, but when the surf was up, whether it was out at the ranch or along the coast, no matter what they were doing, they'd grab their boards and go.
Oh, yes. He just dropped everything.
They drop everything. What did you end up doing for your career after Santa Barbara?
Well, after Santa Barbara, I lived in Sierra Madre, which is near Pasadena, and I worked down there at it was Avery Label. And then after that, I came back to Santa Barbara and got my master's in EE, electrical engineering, and I went up to Berkeley and worked for Varian Corporation, the ones that makes the big tubes. And I lived up in Berkeley for several years after that.
I see. So you're always following this technical track. Now, did you ever get involved in the space program? Although it seems to me by this point, I think they were just doing shuttles.
At that point, I was involved in amateur satellites, the AMSAT group. So I was active in following and participating in amateur satellite work. So I would observe some of the launches they did at Vandenberg Air Force Base, for example, because that was just down the road from Santa Barbara. So I witnessed several launches there. And when I lived in Berkeley, I would sometimes come down to see if there's a launch.
And you'll recall when you were at Santa Barbara, when the space shuttle was landing, it would come right over Santa Barbara on its way to the high desert.
That's correct. And I started a magazine, and it was Amateur Television Quarterly, along with Henry Rue. His call is AA9XW now, and it used to be KB9FO. And it was Amateur Television Quarterly. So we were able to obtain press passes to the shuttle landings, particularly those that involved amateur radio. So I witnessed several landings at Edwards were just incredible, because you could hear that double sonic boom as the shuttle would go overhead, and then just a whisper quiet landing as it came in on the runway.
Now, as I recall, did it go out beyond Edwards and then turn around and then come in for the landing?
Yeah, so you would see it zip by, and you hear the double sonic boom, and then it would loop around and come back in for the landing.
Yeah, amazing. In my research, I discovered that you were in the amateur radio magazine business for a while. What was that about?
I used to be the chief editor of 73 magazine.
How did that start?
I was writing articles for 73 Amateur Radio Today magazine, and I always would read the adventures of Wayne Green, W2 Never Say Die.
Right.
And always enjoyed reading his editorials and how he fired people up, both positively and negatively. And one day I called for the editor at 73 to see the status of my article, and he was no longer there. And I got the assistant associate publisher. And so I started working with him. I says, well, if you need any help, I'd love to work for you all. He says, you're hired. So I ended up working for 73 magazine in 1990, and I worked there for almost 3 years. And I had a ball. It was a great place to work for, all kinds of interesting things. I was the managing editor, so I got to choose the front cover and what articles went into every issue. And plus I had a column that I wrote every issue as well. So it was a very, very interesting place.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It was a great magazine. I liked 73 magazine in those days as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you look between 1990, I started, my first issue was June of 1990 to, I believe, November of 92. And my August 1990 issue has got a big high-altitude balloon section on it. And you can find archives that have these magazines in them. And then we started a magazine called Radio Fun as part of that when I was there. And it was just a newsletter format, a newspaper format. And it was designed to bring in newcomers to amateur radio. And I was chief editor of that as well.
And now this message from ICOM America. Create your own band opening. ICOM's newest SDR transceiver, the IC9700, is here today. This new VHF, UHF, and 1.2 GHz all-mode transceiver brings ICOM's direct sampling to the VHF, UHF weak signal world. This radio really has me excited by the possibilities of being able to operate moon bounce or meteor scatter, or with some additional components, the ES-HALE-2 geosynchronous satellite. The IC9700 has the same form factor as the IC7300 and will certainly complement your existing HF radios. The IC9700 all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features such as dedicated amateur satellite operation, color touchscreen, built-in D-Star capability, RF direct sampling on the VHF and UHF bands, dual independent receivers capable of full duplex operation, as well as Dual Watch, ICOM's feature to allow you to listen in two places at the same time. Output power on the IC9700 is 100 watts on 2 meters, 75 on 70 centimeters, and 10 watts on 1.2 gigahertz. The ICOM IC9700 is available now from your local ICOM dealer. If you're at the Dayton Hamvention this weekend and listening to this podcast, the weekend of May 17th to May 19th, 2019, be sure to stop at the ICOM booth in Building 2 to see the new IC9700 and ICOM's complete line of amateur radio transceivers for every band and for every ham radio operator. You can become one of the lucky winners to take home a limited edition swag kit. Visit ICOM's website to enter the drawing, stop at their booth, and also by clicking on the ICOM 9700 image in this week's show notes page. I'm grateful to have ICOM as a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast and appreciate their support. And when you buy your ICOM 9700 at the Dayton Hamvention or at any other fine place where they sell ICOM products, be sure to tell the ICOM dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Who was Joseph Kittinger, and how did he inspire you?
Well, in the late 80s, I saw a documentary of Joseph Kittinger, who at the time was had the record for the highest parachute jump in history. He jumped from 103,000 feet above the earth as part of Project Man High, which was a program that was a pre-astronaut program to test survivability and early spacesuit gear in the edge of space, which pretty much simulates an actual space environment. So I watched a documentary of him stepping out of this little gondola he was riding in, 102,000 feet above the earth. You could see, even during the broad daylight, you could see the curvature of the earth and the blackness of space. He said a little prayer, jumped out, and parachuted down, and just falling, he exceeded the speed of sound. And and then he pulled a parachute at about 20,000 feet and came into a safe landing. So I wanted to experience that myself, but I didn't want to risk my life doing it. So I came up with the thought of using amateur radio equipment and a weather balloon. So I put together a payload that consisted of a TV camera, a TV transmitter, and a beacon transmitter that we could track on. At the time, there was no GPS satellites. So I came up with, observed the weather balloon launches they do to study the winds aloft for NOAA launches these, and the Weather Service launches balloons all over the country twice a day. I found the site where they did that near my hometown and observed what they did. I determined what size balloon I would need I had about a 2-pound package, and we let it go, and we had reception on UHF on a 1-watt TV transmitter out to 300 miles or more. As you know, propagation on UHF and VHF bands is pretty much line of sight. Imagine, if you will, if you had a 100,000-foot tall ham radio antenna,
right,
how far you would be able to work on VHF and UHF. And that's pretty much what you have. The balloon is the antenna. So you're up 100,000 feet above the earth. You can see the line of sight range is around 400 miles or more. So we had a fantastic success. Unfortunately, the batteries died on the way down, and We were unable to locate it, unfortunately, for that day. But 6 weeks later, I had a backup recovery system on the payload. My address, phone number, and reward sign. So a farmer who was harvesting his crops found it in the middle of his field and gave me a call. And it was only a few hundred feet from where we had been searching for it. But it was buried down in a soybean field. You couldn't see it unless you were right on top of it. And we got it back. I still have that package today.
Now, did that payload come down with the weather balloon? I mean, do you burst the balloon and...
The balloon goes up. It's a rubber latex balloon, and it will pop. And then we have a parachute balloon that pops open, and it carries it down.
I see. So you jettison the balloon so that it won't get tangled up in the parachute? And
it stays attached, but it flops around above the parachute. And quite often, most of it will disappear anyways.
Oh, how interesting. A May 2017 QST magazine article described you as the master of high-altitude balloon projects. And I think you answered the question, why high altitude, because that's why I asked it. Are all of your balloon projects high altitude?
No, not all of them. The typical latex weather balloon will go up, and these are big balloons. They take 100 to 200 cubic foot of helium or hydrogen. They'll go up over 100,000 feet in altitude, but they only last about a 2-hour total flight. Lately, I've been getting into Pico Ballooning, which is on the opposite scale of things, because you can fly 12 pounds of payloads on weather balloons, 6 pound max per payload. So the Pico balloons fly on a 36-inch Mylar party balloon.
Really? They're like the kind of party balloons you'd find at the drugstore.
Right. They make a really big one, a 36-incher.
Mm-hmm.
And the silver ones seem to work the best. And I developed a tracker, an APRS tracker on VHF, on 2-meter VHF, that weighs 12 grams. It's totally solar-powered. Uses a guitar string for the antenna elements, flexible solar panels, and I used an ultra-thin circuit board. So I designed the circuit in EagleCAD, sent it to a PC board company. I got the blank boards back, and then I hand solder them. And the total weight, solar power and everything, is 12 grams. That's less than half an ounce. And by keeping it under that weight, you can successfully float a Mylar foil party balloon for upwards of 3 weeks, maybe 3 to 4 weeks. And it can take, during the winter, and it floats in the jet stream. It floats around 30,000 feet. And it can take just 14 days to go around the world during the winter, go completely around the world, if you hit the jet streams right and avoid storms. So there is a company that makes a little bit bigger balloon that's about 3 feet wide by 7.5 feet long. And it looks like it's made out of a clear plastic, but it's very impervious to leakage. And they are Scientific Balloon Solutions is the name of the company, and their model SBS-13. And it's more expensive, of course, than the Mylar balloons, but these will float around 42,000 feet or so, and you're above more storms that way, and a greater success about going around the world. One of the flights I flew with that balloon went around the world for 6.5 times and stayed up 75 days. That one was on 20 meters Whisper. I used magnet wire for the antenna wires and the same circuit board that I do for the APRS one. And what I do there is develop a system where you can send 2 frames of Whisper data to send telemetry in the second frame. And then I wrote a Python program to grab that data and convert it to an APRS object and send it directly to the APRS server. So it shows up just like it was an APRS transmission, even though it was a 20-meter Whisper transmission.
Now, it's my understanding that there are some airspaces that you're that amateur radio is not allowed, like over the UK, for example. So do you?
The UK is one of them, Yemen and North Korea. And I have a geofencing algorithm in my code. I'm using just a little tiny Atmel processor, the same that they use in the original Arduino boards. In fact, I use the Arduino development system to program them. And what you had to do is draw a box around the areas you don't want to transmit in, and when it detects it's within that polygon, it just doesn't transmit. So you basically draw a box around each area that is a keep-out zone. Because obviously we don't want to transmit over North Korea. We don't want to start World War III.
Right, but it's interesting that Britain, Yemen, and North Korea are the three countries that...
They don't seem like they have a lot in common.
They don't.
But there's a law on the books in Great Britain that prohibits aerial activities with amateur radio. So you can't even fly a kite or a hot air balloon or even an airplane in Great Britain with amateur radio on board. It's probably some law held over for World War II that they never changed, but I don't know the real reason.
How do you define high altitude when you're looking at balloon launches and deciding how you're going to go? How is that elevation different from other balloon launches at lower elevations in terms of preparation and...
Okay, well, you're talking about versus a hot air balloon flight?
No, so for example, high altitude is we're talking about 100,000 feet, for example, but what elevation does it become high altitude? I mean, the Mylar balloons won't go any higher than 40,000 feet.
Well, you can still consider that to be high altitude. I would consider high altitude to be anything higher than a hot air balloon can typically fly.
Which is just a couple thousand feet.
You would still consider a Mylar balloon flight at 30,000 feet to be high altitude.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But probably another definition, if you will, is for a latex weather balloon, high altitude would be anything in the stratosphere. So obviously we're not in the stratosphere for the Pico balloons, but it's still higher than you would normally be able to fly.
Right, and I guess what's interesting is with the Pico balloons is that you actually get to see how the jet stream works in terms of, where it takes the balloon and what the routes are. And
well, that's the neat thing. It's a great tool. I go into a lot of schools, and I talk about weather patterns and how to predict where the jet stream will go. And we actually go through how to predict where the balloon will travel. And they learn about planning a mini space mission. They feel like they're planning a NASA mission. And they really are having a very low Earth orbiting satellite, particularly if it ends up going around the world. And the beauty of it is the students learn about space, technology, education, and math, science, technology, education, and math, as well as learning about amateur radio and how it's used to receive the telemetry. And in fact, that has generated quite a few amateur radio operators who get their license, primarily to get involved in amateur radio ballooning. So it's been and then they go on to experience all the other aspects. Some of these students I've worked with at the college level weren't even aware that there was amateur radio until they've joined up on one of these projects. So It's a great inspiration for learning about science and technology as well as amateur radio.
Have you been approached by the ARRL Teachers Institute? They do the summer training in electronics and robotics and amateur radio for classroom teachers in order to allow them to be able to take these concepts back to their classrooms. It seems to me that this should be a part of their of the ARRL Teachers Institute as a way to kind of spread yourself across the country. Have you been approached by them on this?
I would love to talk to them.
Yeah, it seems to me.
I'm aware of the program.
It's quite it seems like it could be quite infectious. And I think nowadays with kids have smartphones or iPads or something, they can actually in real time, track their balloon.
Well, I was just going to mention that the way you hook today's students is that you incorporate their smartphones and iPads and tablets. If you can incorporate a smartphone and show them how to track these balloons in real time on their smartphone, you have them hooked. That's exactly right.
Well, that's very cool. Well, you're inspiring me to do something here. Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. What are the major challenges of high-altitude ballooning and these balloon launches, and how did you overcome them? In 2017, the article in QST said that you had already launched 500 balloon launches.
I'm close to 600 now. I sat down and watched how the Weather Bureau did it, observed Joe Kittinger's flights with the MAN program, and it's all about the major components are getting the right amount of lift to get the ascent rate, the size of the parachute to determine your descent rate based on the weight of your payload. But the key is for a regular high altitude flight that's going to pop and parachute back to Earth, you would really like to get your payload back, particularly if you're flying very expensive GoPro cameras or have expensive tracker systems on board, or experiments. We send up some school experiments quite a bit. The kids will come in and bring all kinds of matter experiments to fly. One of them flew a banana, and when it came back, it was all brown and mushy, for example. So that was a good experiment. Fishing crickets. One group of students brought in fishing crickets, and they had looked up on the internet that crickets can hold their breath for 2 hours. Now, 80 above about 50 to 60,000 feet, you're in a near vacuum. So this is a good test of that internet rumor. And when we got that experiment back, they did survive. So that particular internet rumor was true. Of course, you believe everything you read on the internet, right?
No, you do, of course. Would you say that was the most unusual payload that you launched?
We've done a glider, a paper airplane, and we had a tracker on the paper airplane and released it from 60,000 feet and watched it spiral back to Earth. It was a 4-foot-long paper glider with a tracker on it, and we were able to get both of them back. We launched rockets from balloons. We had a 400-pound rocket, and we had to launch that in the Gulf of Mexico. We did one off the coast of North Carolina that actually at the time was the highest amateur rocket ever flown, because the balloon was the first stage of the rocket, and we were in the 2000 Guinness Book of Records for that. So those are a lot of variety, ranging from 400-pound rocket payloads all the way down to a half-ounce Pico tracker. So kind of covered the whole range.
Do you have sponsors for balloon launches? It seems to me that you've got to have quite a budget to pull off 600 balloon launches.
My sponsor is my billfold.
Okay.
Some people have hobbies, buying sports cars.
Uh-huh.
And so this is my passion and hobby.
I see. So Pico Ballooning has probably reduced the overall cost of your deployments.
Well, yes and no. With as I was explaining with the regular weather balloons, you can do a winds aloft prediction based on the ascent rate and the parachute descent. And using the wind forecast models that you can find online, you can actually predict where it's going to land fairly accurately within a couple of miles, typically. So that narrows down our search range. And I like to have triple redundancy on an expensive payload where I'm flying a lot of cameras, in that I have 3 trackers and a satellite tracker on board. Quite often you'll land in an area where you aren't near a APRS receiver or digipeater, so you may not be able to hear it, but the satellite tracker will send a signal directly to the tracker. For example, you've probably heard of the Find Me spot. Uses the Global Star network. I use one of those. And I developed my own satellite tracker using the Iridium satellite network. So those are nice backup systems for when you fly a big payload. For the Pico balloon payloads, you probably aren't going to see them ever again. Although I do have my email address on the solar panels, and I have gotten some back. Typically, if you're successful, they're probably going to end up coming down eventually in the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. So, or out in the middle of Siberia or the Sahara Desert, where no one will ever see them again. So that's the risk you take with the Pico balloons. But the goal, of course, is a long duration mission that lasts days and weeks, so the students can follow it each day on their smartphones, and they get to learn about the cultures and the civilizations that they fly over, and so they actually learn a lot about societies as well.
And they learned some geography, because there's a surprising number of adults, young adults these days that don't know where different countries are on the map.
Absolutely.
So what a great thing. Now, you mentioned that you've flown 400-pound rockets off the coasts in Baja and off the East Coast. Do you find that there are special places, best places, or places that are better for balloon launches than other places? Well,
your best location is to fly in a region that has few mountains, lots of flat farmland. So some of the most ideal areas to fly a traditional weather balloon is the American Midwest, or any place that there is a lot of farmland and few forests and few mountains. Where I first did my first flight in Findlay, Ohio, that was an ideal area because it's just all flat farmland. But you can fly anywhere as long as you do a good prediction. I have friends that fly in Idaho, and you have to be very precise to land in the valley instead of these really terrible mountains. And so you have to then choose where your launch site will be to land where you want it to come down. So you have that kind of option that you have to look at. So you can adjust your launch site for an optimal.
Are there seasons that are better than other seasons for launching balloons?
If you want to have an easy, quick recovery, you'll probably want to launch from springtime to fall because it stays relatively close to you. In the wintertime, you can go upwards of 200 miles downrange. So you can fly during the middle of the winter, but expect that you're going to have a long chase. Whereas there are some times during June and July that when the jet stream tends to die down, that you can actually launch it and it will come back and almost land on top of you again after going up to 100,000 feet above the earth. Spring is a great time, and summer and fall. But you can also launch in the winter, as a lot of people do, but just remember the jet stream is typically at its highest. I've actually seen some balloon payloads going over 200 knots ground speed.
Wow.
In the jet stream.
Well, that's pretty amazing. And what do you like better? You say that you've done both APRS and Whisper. Seems to me that with Whisper, you might actually find it if it's laying on the ground somewhere.
That's a good question, too. Whisper is primarily for doing a Pico balloon. That's going to end up going over the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific, far, far away from any possible VHF APRS ground stations. So if you want data during the flight when you're doing a long-duration Pico balloon flight and you want to hear it and see its position, the advantage of Whisper, I'm only running 20 milliwatts on the 20-meter band on my Whisper payload. And keep in mind, it's also totally solar-powered, so it's only on during the daytime. But on the 20-meter band during the day, I can get reception thousands of miles away, whereas on APRS, at 30,000 feet, it's about 250 miles to maximum. So that's the big advantage to a Whisper mode payload. The disadvantage is having a payload that has a 34-foot long wire on it made out of fragile magnet wire. It's an order of magnitude more difficult to launch than an APRS transmitter. So for school events, typically I will fly an APRS transmitter because it's so easy to launch. But if the weather is really calm and really good, then I will go with the whisper mode, just because of the worldwide coverage. And yes, you're right. I had one land in the Mojave Desert, and it started reporting its position every day. The wire, when it was found, the wire was flat in the sand in both directions, and it was being received from over 1,000 miles away. However, there is one drawback. It's a 6-digit grid square, so you're constrained to a 2 by 3 mile search area. That's all the closer you're going to be able to get the position report on Whisper. And so my friend had to drive around in a Jeep out in the sands for several hours until he got the biggest signal strength. And when he stopped, it was really strong. And then he saw the balloon, saw the wire, traced the wire back, and found the payload underneath his tire. Fortunately, he just ran over the solar panel, and it only slightly damaged the payload. It was still working.
Now, I had a conversation with Hans Summers, G0UPL, about exactly this and, these micro balloons. I think he was saying to me that they had modified the Whisper data so that they could actually get the GPS coordinates.
That's right. What I do is I send 2 telemetry frames. One is your standard Whisper. It's just basically your call sign, a 4-digit grid square, and a 2-digit power level. I send a second frame, just like Hans does, and that I incorporate. My system is different than his. There are similarities, but also differences. I incorporate the 5th and 6th grid square digits into another call sign that begins with a 0 or Q, which are invalid call signs in the ITU. So there's going to be no one else flying a 0 or Q call sign. And then, since if there's other people flying Whisper balloons, where the number would be in the call sign, that is a channel number assigned to different flights. For example, I have the 7 and 8 numbers because I fly a lot of them. And so that way we can coexist and have multiple Whisper Pico balloon payloads flying. And then we can embed in the other characters the number of satellites being tracked, the temperature, and the solar panel voltage. Hans also uses the grid square on the second transmission to embed data, and they've modified the WhisperNet website because it used to put position reports all over the world when he did that, but they've modified it now to filter out calls on the map that begin with a 0 and a Q. I don't touch the grid square myself because I match that with the first one so that if somebody else is flying a Whisper balloon and they have my channel number, it won't interfere with me because I match the grid squares between the first transmission and the telemetry frame. And then I use Python. I wrote a program to grab that data from the whispernet.org web database, and I decode the telemetry, reformat it into an APRS position report, and I send it to the APRS servers. What Hans does is to decode it in a similar manner, but he sends it to his own tracking site, and also he also sends it to a really cool website that the UK High Altitude Society has designed called tracker.habhub.org. That's Hotel Alpha Bravo, Hotel United Bravo. Basically stands for High Altitude Balloon Hub. If you want to see every balloon, both Whisper and traditional weather balloons, flying in the world at any given moment, you go to that website and it'll show you everything that is flying currently in the world.
And I did that today, and it looks like there's maybe, 12 balloons up right now, something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very cool.
And if you see a position report over the middle of the ocean, then that is likely a Whisper balloon. I had one flying with APRS that just went by Japan about 3 or 4 days ago. And it hit a storm. It had been up for 14 days, launched from Alabama here, and went across northern Africa. Well, actually, I went south of you, went across Saudi Arabia. There was only one tracking station in that whole region on APRS, and that's a station in Qatar, A75 GE. Unfortunately, I went over to his location during nighttime.
It wasn't working because there's no battery on board.
Right. So we didn't get a reception report until it ended up over China. Then the next day, it was over Japan and hit a large storm, and it was knocked out of the sky after 14 days in this big storm. And it was fighting. It went clear down to the freeze level and bounced around there for several hours. And I think it finally got knocked down. I'm not completely certain it's gone. I'm hoping to see if it shows up over Hawaii today.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has been a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast for a few years already. The biggest reason is that I have an affinity for building electronic devices, especially kits that are well designed and delivered ready to build. Hans Summers, G0UPL QRP Labs founder, owner, and engineering designer, creates the most state-of-the-art transmitters, receivers, and transceiver kits at a very fair price to allow any ham to get on the air for very little money. Be sure to look for Hans in Dayton at the 4 Days in May event at the Fairborn, Ohio Holiday Inn on the Thursday before Hamvention, and at the convention itself in Building 6. I want to thank Hans for continuing to support the QSO Today podcast, and I want to thank you for always using the link on the show notes page to get to QRP Labs, or if you make purchases in person, by telling Hams at the convention that you heard about it here on QSO Today. QRP Labs is my favorite kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to my QSO Today. What kind of budget does one have to have?
Your biggest expense will be, now your tracking equipment will usually be a one-time expense, and GoPro camera payloads, people like to fly those a lot to see that view that Kittinger saw of the curvature of the Earth and the blackness of space. And those things are well expensive. You can have over $1,000 in your payload. Your trackers range upwards to $200 or more for an APRS tracker or a satellite tracker. So you could well have over $1,000 worth of equipment flying underneath your balloon on a traditional weather balloon flight. Then your expendables, you're going to have about $120 in the balloon and probably another $100 in helium to inflate the balloon at current prices. Unless you go with hydrogen, and then it's about half the cost. But I would still plan on probably anywhere from $150 to $200 in the balloon, and you won't get that back. The balloon's going to pop, and you're going to lose the lifting gas. So that's a rough estimate of the cost of a latex weather balloon flight. And then you also, if you want it back, you have to plan on your expedition and your gas costs to go out and get it, and what it takes to put in your ground station in your car. So those are all things to consider there. Now, it's a Pico balloon flight. Your biggest expense is going to be in the tracker. I currently offer the APRS Sky Tracker, I call my board, for $149. But that is a complete all-in-one, GPS included. It's all on one board, transmitter and everything. You just take it outside, tie it to a balloon, and let it go. It's ready to fly. Now the balloon, if you fly the silver Mylar foil balloons, they're about $4 a piece. And you have maybe a couple of dollars worth of helium in it. You can buy one of these little party balloon tanks for about $20, $25.
Now, it's my understanding from reading an article, I think that you wrote about this, or something online, that you don't fill that party balloon completely up with the helium, right?
That's correct, because it's going to go up to, if you put too much in it, it'll go up and it'll pop. If you put too little in it, then you may not clear the trees and it may not float well. So there's a very fine balance, and you have to get it probably within plus or minus a half a gram, plus or minus a gram. So I buy this little gram scale from Amazon and use that. Grant.
So essentially, it's pulling on the scale, and you just put enough helium in it so that it's just slightly more than that.
Well, I measure the actual lift. You want to have, for a successful party balloon flight, you want to have about 3 grams extra lift over the weight of the payload at the neck of the balloon. So when you're ready to fly, you're going to have 3 grams of positive lift.
Oh, I see. Okay.
If you go over that, the balloon will pop. I think roughly over 4 grams, you probably won't have a successful flight, and you probably don't want to go much below 2 grams. So between 2 and 4 grams. So, but you have to be pretty accurate. Now, what I do is I have a little weight bag that I clip on the balloon when I'm inflating it. And when it just lifts that off the table, I know it's lifting the right amount, and then I double check it with my gram scale. But sometimes I don't even bother with the gram scale if it looks accurately enough, just to watch it lift off the table with the weights that I pre-weighed before the flight to get that exact amount of lift. And I'll also double check it before flight by taping a U.S. penny to it, which weighs 2.5 grams. And if it just slightly goes up, I'm good. And then I put a nickel on it, tape it, and that's 5 grams. If it goes down, then I know I'm pretty much in the right range. So I do a little double check before I lift off. With a big weather balloon flight, you're talking about lifting pounds of material, and if you're off a little bit, a pound or 2 either way, it's not going to make a lot of difference. The tricky part with the Pico balloons is to get it accurate to within about 1 gram or 2, plus or minus 1 gram or less, and that's the trickiest part. You have to weigh everything: the tape, the fishing line, everything that's attached to the balloon.
Wow. Okay. Do you have a YouTube channel?
I do. It's under my call sign, Whiskey Bravo 8 Echo Lima Kilo. I also have an email for those who would like to contact me about Pico ballooning and regular high altitude ballooning, and that's Whiskey Bravo 8 Echo Lima Kilo at Gmail. So WB8ELK at gmail.com. And my website is WB8ELK.com.
Okay, I'll put all these in the show notes pages for people to be able to just go there, and if they're driving, they won't get into an accident while they're writing this down.
But I also am offering the Sky Trackers to those interested, both APRS and Whisper mode. So just call me, email me for particulars on that.
I'm thinking of doing one myself and actually notifying my community here that I'm doing it, so that they'll probably be nicer to me as I'm putting more antennas on my house.
There you go.
Is there a community around your launches? I mean, are there people that are following you and are out there available if they want to recover a tracker?
I think one of the best resources is there's a chat room that UK High Altitude Society puts together, and they have people sign up from all over the world to chat with each other about high altitude ballooning. And it's I have to think of the name of it, but it's a web chat link, and it's pound high altitude.
Okay, I'll confirm that and put that in the show notes as well. What's the current rig at your QTH?
Actually, I use a FunCube dongle for most of my reception, because it's a wonderful SDR dongle that has all kinds of free software that you can see the entire bandwidth, what's going on. But for transmit, I have a TS2000, and I have an ATV transceiver and antennas. I live 500 feet up on a mountain, so even though my antennas are only up about 15 feet on a tripod, it's like I have a 500-foot antenna.
Now, your ATV, are you doing that on microwave?
I'm primarily on the 70-centimeter band and the 23-centimeter bands.
Do you still operate satellites?
I still operate satellites, yes. I have an Azel rotor for that.
Uh-huh. And you use the FunCube dongle for the reception and the TS2000 with transverters or something for the... Or does the TS2000 also work in the UHF?
Yeah, a combination of the two. But if I'm just monitoring or receiving, I have a whisper station that's always listening, and I typically use the FunCube dongle for that, for receiving whisper. And also, my whisper transmitter, Sky Trackers, they make a great little home station at 25 milliwatts. I put those on the air through a little SMA connector, and I can get reception on those from around the world if the conditions are right. I had one tracker over the middle of the Atlantic, so we're talking magnet wire dipole and a 25 milliwatt transmitter. It was heard in Perth, Australia, exactly on the other side of the world, and copied. So it's amazing how far whisper mode can be received.
It makes you wonder whether the problems with propagation is sunspots or people just listening instead of transmitting.
Well, it has to do mostly with the weak signal decoding software that can pull a signal so far out of the noise level.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it?
That low power can go a long ways. Now, most people on Whisper are probably running 100 milliwatts up to 5 watts. There are a few that transmit around 20 milliwatts like I do, and it's just amazing how far you can get with even that tiny little bit of power.
What do you think the greatest challenge is to amateur radio now, being almost 50 years in?
The challenge is getting our students fired up about amateur radio, and one of the methods that I use is to get them involved in high-altitude ballooning, because the fact that they can send telemetry very efficiently using ham radio and use it for cool projects like a mini space program, that gets them excited a lot. And I think the digital modes are really a great way to bring newcomers into amateur radio.
So it would be fair to say that you're excited by the digital modes now, including FT8?
Oh, yes, very definitely.
Is there anything else that really excites you about what's happening in amateur radio besides those modes?
I love 10 meters whenever it opens up. I've been a 1010 member for many, many years.
That's the 1010 International Club, right?
That's right. I have a very low number because I joined in 1970.
Is there something else, Bill, that you're doing that I haven't touched on?
That's the majority of it, other than I now, my job has changed. I'm working on the SLS rocket at NASA.
Really? What's your current occupation?
System safety engineer.
And the reason you're living in Alabama is because you're close to NASA. Right,
Marshall Space Flight Center.
And what are you doing exactly there?
We're making sure that the SLS, the Space Launch System rocket, will be successful and safe.
I see. But what you're doing there, you're acting as an electronic engineer.
Correct.
I see. Well, that sounds really cool. It sounds to me like your life and career has gone full circle from Sputnik to SLS.
That's exactly right.
Well, that's pretty amazing. Are you anywhere near retiring?
Oh, no. I'll keep working until I'm unable to drive anymore.
Well, my father tells me, who's just 89, that he says as soon as they remove the yellow line on the right side of the road, he's finished driving. But until that time, his license is good until he's 96.
I'll keep driving until they have flying cars.
That might fly you automatically. You'll just call it with your with your
then
smartphone.
Where we're going, we won't need roads.
Yeah, there you go. Bill, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the QSO Today podcast. I know it's taken us some time to get it organized, but I'm really delighted that you were able to spend this hour with me and talk about the amateur view of space. So with that, I want to wish you 73 and thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
And it has been a real pleasure, and 73 to you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Bill. Please be sure to check the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in WB8ELK in the search box at the right top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.